Hello, my name is Simmons, and this is my senior lecture recital project. Today I'll be speaking to you about the development of the clarinet. The four topics that we will be covering on our agenda today is topic 1 of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Clarinet Concerto in A. Topic 2 will be about Robert Alexander Schumann, Fantasiestücke, fantasy pieces. Topic 3 will be about Camille Saint-Saens, Clarinet Sonata, and topic 4 will be on our sources and thank yous. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart dates 1756 through 1791. Mozart was known as one of the classical era composers of all times. During this time, the clarinet was built in the 1700s, being a big part of the classical era of development. The classical period of music was an era that lasted from 1730 to 1820 approximately, although it extended until the mid-19th century. This is an essential aspect of the development of the clarinet due to its relevance in the invention time, but also with composers finally being able to compose music for the clarinet, giving it a voice to be heard. So after I speak to you about Mozart, I will be playing the Clarinet Concerto in A with the A clarinet later on for you, movement 2, known as Adagio. Be silent if you choose, but when it's time to speak, and speak in such a way that people will remember it. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Mozart's sketch of life is pretty long. He was born January 27th of 1756 in Salzburg, Austria. But he was known as profoundly shaping classical music at that time. He was also influenced by Johann Christian Bach and the son of Johann Sebastian Bach. By the age 13, he took his first trip to Italy with his father and got to hear more famous composers and test out his young prodigy skills by writing 2 operas at the same time. He was also influenced by the teachings of his father, Leopold Mozart. He had many talents as a kid. He played piano, organ, and violin by the age of 5. In his late teenage years, Mozart had multiple positions concurrently, which challenged his time for compositional writing. As the sketch of his life continues, Mozart was known as a composer, but also a performer who wrote many solos and ensemble works. One of the positions Mozart held during his time was a court musician in his hometown Salzburg, Austria. In 1777, he ended up leaving Austria in his court musician position and traveled to France and Germany. And then after, he reported in 1778 that Mozart's mother, Anna Maria Perl Mozart, passed away, which gave him a reason to return back home in Austria. In 1779, he wrote a series of church compositions, and by 1781, he moved to Vienna, Austria, where he continued as a composer and performer. One of his solo work examples are, or known as, the Clarinet Concerto in A. Mozart continued working in Vienna and became appreciated for his compositional works. Well, Mozart's music expanded throughout Austria, which developed music programs and performing opportunities for others. He wrote publications while he continued to perform. By 1785, he wrote 3 piano concertos and 6 quartets dedicated to his dear friend Antoine Stadler, Joseph Haydn, and so many more. The classical era influenced the austere lines of certain solos, and he can also be seen in some of Mozart's piano music of the time and in his string arrangements. Well, Mozart did struggle a little bit mentally with depression, manic disorders, and pneumonia, which impacted him and his family before his death. Well, Mozart passed away in 1791 at the age of 35 in Vienna, Austria. There have been rumors about his death. However, some attributed that he passed away from rheumatic fever that he had been diagnosed with throughout his life. But he ended up publishing a society named after him called the Mozarteum, which is pretty much a museum for Mozart's works and arts, which provided all his compositional works and publications after his death. Mozart is still known as one of the most memorable composers of all time and a great influence on clarinet music today. Next, I will be talking to you about the historical context behind what a concerto is and what the second movement of this concerto in particular. Mozart was one of the first to compose piano concertos, but also clarinet concertos, as we know them today. Piano concertos are like lively conversations between the piano and the orchestra. A concerto is defined as a musical piece designated for a soloist or soloist and an orchestra. The concerto consists of 3 movements. The first movement is fast and usually in sonata form. The second movement is slow and poetic, more singing-like, and the third one is once again fast, but often in a rondo sonata or sonata variations. And later on, I will tell you more about what a sonata is with another composer. At the end of the first movement, there is a cadenza as well as another cadenza in the second movement, where the soloist displays the virtuoso abilities and sometimes even improvises without any pre-written notes. Mozart developed the classical concerto, as we all know. The concerto consists of obviously 3 movements, but it was also written within 2 months before his death in October of 1791. This concerto in particular was written for a basset clarinet. And as you can see beside me, this is an A clarinet, and it's a little longer and taller than a usual B flat clarinet. This piece was also written for his closest friend, Anton Stadler, and the Adagio movement of the clarinet concerto in A is probably the slowest movement out of all 3. It demonstrates passion, but also expresses the gratitude and depression of Mozart's time with his mental health. As we continue, we'll find out that this piece is in 3/4 and is known as a rounded binary form. Now you shall hear me play Clarinet Concerto in A, Movement 2, Adagio. Next in my lecture, we'll be speaking about Robert Alexander Schumann, dates 1810 through 1856. Mr. Schumann was known as a part of the Romantic era, but also a part of clarinet music, piano music, any type of music he could write, and became a part of the Romantic era of development of this clarinet. So many composers at this point of the Romantic era saw music as a means of individual and emotional expression. Well, they considered music the art for most capable of expressing the full range of human emotions. As a result, Romantic composers such as Schumann broadened the scope of emotional content. Music was expected to communicate to the audience, often by using a narrative form that told distinct stories. Romantic composers prioritized the emotional or narrative content of the music above its form, which is why they broke many of the classical era composers' rules. Romantic composers didn't reject or break with the music language developed during the classical period, but they did use it in forms of foundation for their work, but felt unconstrained by them. Beethoven is the originator of this approach. He lived and worked during the transition of the classical era through the Romantic period, and was an inspiration to the Romantic composers who came after him. After I speak to you about Schumann, I will be playing the first movement of Fantasiestücke, fantasy pieces on the B-flat clarinet. Nothing right can be accomplished in art without enthusiasm. Robert Schumann. Schumann's time. His timeline discusses his birth, career, achievements, and death. He was born June 8, 1810 in Trukwa, Saxony, Germany. Copious composer Robert Alexander Schumann has been known as the greatest composer of the Romantic era. He was expressed with renowned composer for his piano and concerto works, but also for his orchestral works in his early years. Also in his earlier years, his father, August Schumann, was known as the bookseller and publisher novelist, and his mother was Johanna Christian Schnabel, also known for her publication. Schumann attended a private school for 4 years, and by the age of 7, he began general music and piano lessons. By the age 14, Schumann wrote an essay on the aesthetics of music. Influenced by the works of John Paul Friedrich Richter, he also developed an interest in the works of musical moguls such as Ludwig van Beethoven, Franz Schubert, and Felix Mendelssohn. But on the other hand, after the death of his father in 1826, Schumann was only 16, and neither his mother or his other guardian encouraged his musical aspirations, but wanted him to be a lawyer instead. As he continued through his years of career, he created Opus 1, the Adagio variations for piano, in 1831. The 1830s were his great achievements. And then, due to an accident with his right hand, breaking his finger, the artist had to abandon his career as a virtuoso and turned its focus to compositions. The 1830s were great for him, but in 1834, Schumann inaugurated Die Neue Schrift für Musik, which was the new journal for music, which was the first published in 1834. In 1837, Schumann published his own symphonic studies, a complex set of etude-like variations that he wrote from 1834 through 1835, and demanded a finished piano technique as well. As of Schumann's time as a composer, he created many works that had a good selection of major works, such as Papillons, David of Bunstron's Carnaval, Wie Lieder, and The Bride of Messina Overture. He then died in 1856 back home in Saxony, Germany. Now I will speak to you about the context of a fantasy, also known as a fantasia. Fantasia is known as a fantasy or fantasy, and is also defined as a composition free in form and inspiration, usually for an instrumental soloist. In the 17th and early 18th centuries in Germany, the organ fantasia reflected his improvisatory character, in direct contrast to the highly structured fugue that usually followed. The main instruments used throughout the genre during the Romantic era were strings, flutes, piccolos, oboes, clarinets, bassoons, double bassoons, trumpets, trombones, French horns, percussion, and the piano. The expressed that freedom of form and execution persisted in the fantasias of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and Franz Schubert, some of which retained the fugal element as well. Schumann in his Fantasie, Opus 17, and like Frederick Chopin in his Fantasie in F minor. This maintained the tradition of single, self-contained movement, at least outwardly. Schumann frequently composed in the Fantasia genre. Robert Schumann once said, "Listening to Fantasiestücke Opus 73 forces us to live and enjoy the moment." The three short fantasy pieces written in just over 2 days in February of 1849 are filled with abrupt, slightly schizophrenic, and mood changes. Moments of deep introspection followed by bursts of euphoria reminds us of Florenstein and Eusebius, the split personalities which inhabit much of Schumann's music. The particular piece was written strictly for clarinet and piano. As you will see later, Fantasiestücke Fantasy Pieces Opus 73, Movement 1 is composed in known of what we call a common time or 4/4 time. Within the first movement, the tempo is known as Adagio, but we'll be speeding it up a little bit while I play. This is relatively a moderate movement to begin with for the piece. I shall now play for you Fantasiestücke Opus 73 Fantasy Pieces, Movement 1, Zart und mit Ausdruck. Next, I'll be speaking to you about Camille Saint-Saens, dates 1835 through 1921. The artist who does not feel completely satisfied by elegant lines, by harmonious colors, and by a beautiful succession of chords, does not understand the art of music. Camille Saint-Saens. Saint-Saens Alpha and Omega. He was born October 9th, 1835 in Paris, France. He was known as a virtuoso composer and is remembered for his symphonic poems in the 20th century. Yet that his dates are in the 20th century, we find out that he's more known as the Romantic era development of the clarinet as well. He was also known as the only child of Jacques Joseph Victor Saint-Saens and his wife Françoise Clemence in Paris. His father was an official in the French Ministry of the Interior. Saint-Saens was notable for his pioneering efforts on behalf of French music, and he was a gifted pianist and organist, as well as a writer of criticism, poetry, essays, and plays. He studied organ and composition at the Paris Conservatory, and he also started as a child prodigy on the piano and started performing in small audiences and performances from the beginning at 5 years old until he was 10. He also studied French, literature, Latin, and Greek. In 1855, his Symphony No. 1 was performed. He became an organist at the famed Church of Madeleine in Paris in 1857, an association that lasted for 20 years. He adopted the techniques of Franz Liszt and his virtuosity style after playing organ with him for a good while. He developed the technique of French traditions, form, and harmony after gaining insight into Liszt's style, which contributed to his creation of Symphony No. 3. Saint-Saens' opera Samson and Delilah was rejected in Paris because of the prejudice against portraying biblical characters of the stage was given in German and in Weimar in 1877 on the recommendation of Liszt. Schumann's death and afterlife. He lived the life of a bachelor until well into his 30s, sharing a home with his mother. Then he fell in love with Marie-Laure Truffaut, the young sister of one of his students, and married her in 1875. The couple had 2 sons, both of whom unfortunately died in infancy. The terrible loss deeply affected the couple and their marriage collapsed. He eventually separated from his wife. After the breakdown of his marriage, he never became involved with any other woman. In later years, he sought solace in the company of his friend and former pupil, Gabriel Fauré, and his family. Saint-Saens then continued to write music and then died from a heart attack in 1921. Now I'll talk to you about the context of sonata form. Sonata form throughout his music in the 20th century was very much well known. Even though the sonata form was highlighted and originated in the classical era, as I said before, it was still a very well-known used genre. Sonata was known as defined as a form, a type of musical composition, usually for a solo instrument or a small instrumental ensemble that typically consists of 2 to 4 movements or sections, in each a related key but with a unique musical character. Within the sonata form are sections known as the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. Depending on the type of sonata, small groups or instruments are used. Many composers of the 20th century used sonata forms such as Arnold Schoenberg, Igor Stravinsky, Richard Wagner, Claude Debussy, and many more. This work was one of his last pieces that he composed in 1921 for the woodwind instruments. And Saint-Saens once said, "At the moment I am concentrating my last reserves on giving rarely considered instruments the chance to be heard." The Clarinet Sonata by Saint-Saens, Movement 1, is composed in a compound meter 12/8. During the first movement, the tempo is Allegretto. This is known as one of the more faster movements of the composition. I will be particularly performing the Recapitulation, which is at the end, and it is the repetition of the beginning, but in a different key and form. Now I will present to you the Clarinet Sonata, Movement 1, Allegretto. And I'd like to give a huge thank you to Pat Gaddy, my clarinet instructor, Dana Ballard, my accompanist, Dr. Cynthia Ramsey for helping me through this research, Cal Greeny, who also helped to teach me, Dr. Johnson Scott for helping me with research, my peers, the support system, the audience, and the University of Lynchburg Music Department. Thank you.